My daughter called me a servant, not a father. I cut off all her funding, blocked her cards, and walked away. She realized everything far too late. Subscribe to the channel and share your stories in the comments. And now, let's get started. Michael had always believed that love could be built like a house. Board by board, hour by hour, as long as your hands didn't tremble. For 17 years, he'd built his around his daughter, Sarah, the only thing left of the woman he buried when he was 30. He had promised her mother, whispered into the hospital air heavy with antiseptic and loss, that he would never let their child feel alone. He kept that promise with the devotion of a man who had nothing else left to give. He worked, he cooked, he packed lunches with sticky notes that said, "You're my favorite reason to wake up." He sat through school recitals, soccer games, dentist appointments, the small rituals that make a childhood feel like a home. Every moment was an offering, every sacrifice invisible but real. And when the loneliness crept in at night, when the bed felt too wide and the house too still, he looked at the photo of his daughter asleep in his arms and told himself, "This is enough." For years the house was quiet, but it was warm. The silence wasn't absence. It was peace. Mornings began with the hum of the kettle. Evenings ended with her laughter spilling down the hallway like light. They shared inside jokes, rituals, small routines that tethered their days together. He never remarried, not out of pride, but fear. Fear that a new presence might disturb the fragile balance between them, that Sarah might feel replaced, diminished, unsafe. He made her the center and revolved his life around her orbit. But time doesn't orbit. It drifts. Somewhere between the girl who held his hand and the young woman who avoided his gaze, something shifted. It happened quietly, like rot behind a wall. First it was small, a rolled eye, a tone that made him pause, a muttered whatever when he tried to offer advice. He told himself it was adolescence. Everyone warned him about that phase. He smiled through it, swallowed his pride, repeated the old line. It's not personal, it's growing up. But then the small things grew teeth. She stopped saying Dad, just Michael. The first time she did, it was at the breakfast table. "Michael, can you pass the orange juice?" He froze, the glass halfway to his lips. The name hung between them like an insult wrapped in silk. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did, maybe that was the point. Her laughter, once so easy, became sharper. It had edges now, and sometimes those edges found him. At dinner with her friends, she interrupted him mid-sentence, corrected him, joked that he didn't really get how things worked anymore. The table laughed. Michael laughed too, but his hands tightened under the tablecloth, knuckles whitening against the wood. He tried to tell himself she was just testing limits, that this was part of growing up, that distance meant independence, and independence meant success. But deep down, he knew it wasn't distance she wanted. It was escape. From him, the house began to change. The silence between them wasn't peace anymore. It was vacancy. Doors closed faster. Footsteps retreated quicker. He'd knock on her door to ask about her day. She'd answer without looking up from her phone. Fine. Always fine. The word became a wall he could never climb. Still, he waited. He thought patience could heal what pride had broken. He told himself, just hold on. She'll remember. She'll come back. But memory, like love, fades when ignored long enough. The real crack appeared on a Sunday. A cold, glassy day in downtown Portland. Sarah had forgotten her coat before going out with friends, so he drove across town to drop it off. Just a small gesture, an act of habit, of care. He saw her through the cafe window. 3 young women laughing, phones scattered across the table, their lives blooming wide open while his stayed small and quiet. He stood in line, ordered a coffee he didn't want, then approached the table with her coat folded over his arm. She barely looked up. "Hey," he said softly, smiling, the way fathers smile when they're unsure of their welcome. "Oh," she murmured, distracted. "Thanks." Her friends giggled. One of them asked if he was going to sit. Sarah's answer came too quickly. "No, he's fine. He's just dropping off my stuff." Michael nodded, forced another smile, and turned to leave. The waiter appeared with the check, laying it neatly on the edge of the table. One of the girls reached for her purse, joking about who should pay. That's when Sarah laughed, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "He'll pay," she said. "He's used to being the help." For a second, the world stopped. Even the clatter of dishes seemed to fall away. The words landed like cold metal in his chest. Her tone wasn't cruel. That was what made it worse. It was casual, careless. As if she had said something obvious. The table laughed. Michael smiled faintly, set down a 20, and walked out. Outside, the sky had turned to mist. Rain pressed against the windows, soft and endless. He stood on the sidewalk, coat still in his arms, the faint reflection of the cafe lights flickering across his face. He felt something tear, but quietly. Not with sound, but with silence. He walked for a long time before getting into the car. The city blurred through the windshield, lights smearing into lines. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just drove. That night, when he came home, he placed her coat on the banister and sat in the living room, staring at nothing. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the house, Sarah's door closed. He thought about the years, the bedtime stories, the scraped knees, the promises whispered through hospital walls. He thought about the first day of kindergarten, how she turned back to wave at him through the school gate. And then he thought about her voice at that cafe, sharp, amused, distant. He tried to remember when she stopped needing him, tried to pinpoint the moment love became inconvenience. But it wasn't one moment. It was a slow erosion, a drip of cold water through stone. That night, Michael sat until dawn, staring at the empty hallway, realizing something he had never wanted to admit. The first wound between them hadn't been anger. It was indifference. And indifference is colder than hate, because hate still means you care enough to feel. In the weeks that followed, nothing changed on the surface. They still lived under the same roof. They still exchanged words when necessary. But something invisible had shifted, a gravity had reversed. He moved around her like a ghost, careful not to disturb the air she occupied. She, in turn, looked through him, as if his presence were a transparent nuisance. He began to notice small things. Forgotten plates left on the counter, light switches left on, bills unpaid. Each one chipped away at him, not because of what they meant, but because of what they revealed. That she no longer saw him as the foundation beneath her life, just the furniture of it. Once, late at night, he passed her room and heard her laughing on the phone. The sound used to make him smile. This time it made him stop. Her laughter was different, freer, lighter. The way she used to sound before grief touched their home, before she associated that grief with him. He leaned against the wall, eyes closed, and realized that his daughter's joy now existed in a world that didn't include him. The next morning he cooked breakfast, her favorite. Pancakes, blueberries, the same way he had since she was 5. He left them on the table, waited for her to wake. When she finally came down, she glanced at the plate, picked up a pancake and said, "I'm not really into carbs anymore." Then she left. The plate stayed there until noon, the syrup hardening, the butter turning pale. It was then that Michael understood something terrible. A father doesn't lose his child in a single moment. He loses her by degrees, through silence, through disinterest, through laughter that no longer includes him. And by the time he realizes it, she's already gone. After the cafe, something wordless and heavy settled between them. Michael didn't speak of it, and Sarah didn't notice or pretended not to. Yet the air in the house thickened, day by day, as if grief had returned wearing new clothes. The house itself changed character. It no longer hummed with the soft rhythm of shared life. It pulsed with silence. Her bedroom door, once open to let in music and sunlight, stayed locked. Her laughter, what was left of it, belonged to the phone in her hand, not to the man in the next room. Michael learned to recognize her footsteps on the stairs. Quick, impatient, avoiding him. He still did everything. Paid her tuition, her phone, her dance lessons she barely attended anymore. Bought the groceries she ignored. When he knocked on her door and said dinner was ready, she would call back, "I'll eat later." She never did. He told himself it was just a phase, that she would come around. But deep down he knew. She wasn't rebelling. She was disengaging. There's a difference. Rebellion means you care enough to fight. Disengagement means you've already left. He began to notice the small cruelties that come naturally to the indifferent. She no longer thanked him when he drove her somewhere. When her friends visited, she introduced him by name, never as "my dad." Once, he overheard her talking in the hallway, laughing with a classmate on speakerphone. "My dad?" she said and laughed. "You mean Michael? He's just around." That word, around, stayed with him like a bruise. He started sleeping less, spent long hours at his desk pretending to work. Sometimes he'd wake at 3 a.m. to find her light still on under the door. Once, he stood outside, listening to the muffled sound of her laughter, and wondered when his presence had become an intrusion. He thought about her mother then, about the woman whose absence he had tried to fill for 16 years. He had believed that devotion could replace death, that if he just gave enough time, money, tenderness, he could keep Sarah safe from the coldness of the world. He never imagined the cold would come from her. By winter, she stopped calling him Dad entirely. She said Michael now casually, like she'd always done. The first time she did it in public, it startled him. The third time, it didn't. Every small distance became routine. Every silence became expected. And yet, he kept giving. Because that's what fathers do, even when they are no longer recognized as such. Then came her 18th birthday. The day that should have been his quiet triumph. A closing of the circle. He planned it for weeks. Invited relatives. Cooked her favorite meal himself. He wanted the night to be gentle, redemptive, a chance to start over. He even prepared a gift that meant something. Her grandfather's watch. Old, heavy, golden. The only thing his father had left him. A symbol of continuity, of care. He spent that afternoon polishing the case, tracing the inscription inside. "Time is what love leaves behind." He believed she would understand. When the evening came, the house filled with chatter and warmth. His sister brought wine, his nephews brought laughter. For a few hours, Michael allowed himself to believe the distance might close. Sarah smiled, politely, like a guest in her own home. She opened gifts, perfume, clothes, envelopes with cards, and thanked everyone but him. Finally, he placed his small box before her. "This one," he said softly, "is from me." She looked at it, unimpressed, tore the paper, lifted the lid. The golden watch caught the light. "It belonged to your grandfather," he said. "He gave it to me when I was your age. I thought it was time it went to you." She stared at it, expression unreadable. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Maybe recognition, maybe guilt. Then it vanished. She closed the box. "You try so hard to act like a father," she said flatly. "But you're just my wallet with legs." The words dropped like stones into water. The table went still. His sister froze mid-breath. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. In the silence that followed, even the air seemed to draw away from her. Michael didn't move, didn't blink. He simply stared at her, not in anger but in disbelief, like a man watching a bridge collapse he had spent his life building. "Sarah," his sister whispered, her voice trembling. "That's not." But Sarah only shrugged. "What? It's true." She pushed the box aside. "You don't have to make everything emotional, Michael." The way she said his name, so casual, so clean, was the real cruelty. It wasn't venom. It was detachment. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat refused. Words gathered behind his teeth, heavy as stones, and then fell away. There was nothing left to defend. He stood, quietly, and began clearing the table. Plates, glasses, the remnants of what was supposed to be celebration. No one stopped him. The others exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Sarah looked down at her phone. It was then that something inside him shifted. Not rage, not sorrow, but finality. a cold recognition that he had reached the end of something unspoken. When the guests left, the house returned to silence. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator remained, steady as a heartbeat. Sarah retreated to her room without a word. The door shut with a soft click that sounded, to him, like the closing of a tomb. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the half-eaten cake. The candles were still embedded in it like broken promises. The golden watch lay on the counter, forgotten. He picked it up, turned it in his hand, and felt the old weight of it. He remembered his father's face, the day he gave it to him. "You keep this," his father had said. "So you remember what time costs." Now he understood. Upstairs, music thumped faintly from Sarah's room, some careless beat that made the walls vibrate. He stared up at the ceiling, realizing he no longer knew the person who lived there. He poured himself a drink. The whiskey burned, but the pain felt deserved. For the first time in his life, Michael allowed himself to think the forbidden thought. Maybe love had limits. Maybe devotion was not infinite, and patience not holy. Maybe there was a point when giving became a form of begging. He sat at the table until dawn, the empty glass before him, the watch glinting beside it. When the morning came, he didn't wake her. He didn't speak to her. He went to work, came home, and went straight to his room. Their conversations dwindled to practicalities, tuition reminders, mail deliveries, car maintenance. Each word a transaction, each silence an invoice. Weeks passed that way. The house became a waiting room, two strangers orbiting around what used to be love. And yet, every time he passed the watch on the counter, he couldn't bring himself to put it away. It stayed there, untouched, like evidence of a crime he couldn't report. One night, he heard her laughing on the phone again. The same careless tone. Someone asked about her dad. She said, "Oh, he's fine. Still paying for everything, I guess." He turned off the lights downstairs and sat in the dark, listening. He realized then that the worst betrayal wasn't hate. It was mockery built on dependence. To take from someone while despising the hand that gives. To use love as convenience. He looked at the watch once more and whispered to no one, "Never again." The words hung in the empty kitchen, unnoticed but binding. Because some promises, once broken, can never be remade. And some fathers, once humiliated, stop pretending to be fathers at all. That night, after everyone had gone, the house was still. Not peaceful still, but hollow. The kind of stillness that follows an explosion. Michael sat in the kitchen, the same yellow light humming above the table, the birthday cake half melted under it. The smell of wax and sugar clung to the air. The golden watch lay beside the empty glass. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the grooves of the inscription, the weight of inheritance. Time is what love leaves behind. The words mocked him now. He thought about every year that had led to this moment. Every small decision made out of love, every compromise disguised as patience. He had built his life around a daughter who no longer saw him as a man, only a resource. Every sacrifice he made had been absorbed, expected, forgotten. The truth came slow, like dawn over a frozen field. She didn't hate him. She simply didn't care. And that was worse. He poured himself another drink, though he couldn't taste it. The whiskey was dull. His thoughts were not. They moved with precision, with a strange, icy calm. Upstairs, Sarah's door creaked open. Her footsteps passed down the hall, light and unbothered. She didn't look in on him, didn't speak. The front door opened, closed softly. She was gone again to whatever world had replaced him. Michael looked at the door for a long time. Then he stood. He moved through the house like a man inspecting the ruins of his own life. The framed photos on the walls. Sarah at 6, Sarah in costume, Sarah smiling on his shoulders, stared back at him like ghosts of someone else's story. He traced the edge of a frame with his finger. Dust clung to his skin. He realized then that love, once unreciprocated, turns into something else. Not anger, not sorrow, something colder, clarity. And clarity demanded an ending. He sat back down, opened his laptop and began erasing himself. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't impulsive. It was methodical, like a man closing accounts on a life he'd overpaid for. First, he opened the bank portal. Tuition, phone, rent, car insurance, all in his name. Each payment a quiet tether to a relationship that no longer existed. He canceled them one by one. Tuition, gone. The phone, suspended. Rent, terminated at the end of the month. Each click of the mouse sounded like a nail in the coffin of something sacred. He emptied their joint account, transferred everything into a separate one, left just enough to cover utilities for the next 30 days. He wasn't cruel. He was thorough. Then he wrote a note. Not a letter letters begged to be read. This was a statement. Short, clean, unadorned. You're grown now. Take care of yourself. He placed it on the counter beside the watch. When he looked around the room, the familiarity of it felt like mockery. Every chair, every chipped mug, every dent in the table was a monument to a love that had gone unrewarded. He packed quietly. A duffel bag first, clothes, documents, toiletries. Then the small leather folder that held the last photographs of Sarah's mother. He didn't take much. He wasn't fleeing, he was vacating. The rain began around midnight. Heavy, relentless. The kind that turns streets into mirrors. He stood by the window, watching it hit the glass, watching the reflections ripple. For a brief moment, he imagined her as a little girl again. Standing beside him, pointing at the storm, unafraid. "Look, Dad," she used to say. "The sky's washing itself." He closed his eyes. The memory hurt. When he opened them again, the street outside was empty. He shouldered his bag, turned off the lights, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he hesitated. Not because he doubted himself, but because finality always asks for one last second of weakness. He gave it that second. Then he turned the handle and stepped out. The sound of rain filled the silence. He closed the door behind him. No slam, no echo, just the faint click of the lock sliding into place. He stood on the porch, the rain running cold down his neck. For a long time he didn't move. He just listened to the quiet hum of the city, the distant hiss of tires on wet asphalt. And then he heard it. A voice, faint, muffled by the door. "Dad." He froze. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't demanding. It was small, uncertain. The voice of the little girl he had once known, trapped inside the young woman who had forgotten him. For an instant, the urge to turn back clawed at him, to open the door, to forgive, to start again. But he didn't, because forgiveness at that moment would have been a lie. He took one breath, let the rain fill his lungs, and walked down the steps. The voice came again, softer now. "Dad!" But it wasn't a call. It was an echo. He kept walking. By the time he reached the car, he was drenched. The windshield fogged as he started the engine. He wiped it clear with the back of his hand and looked once more at the house. The porch light was still on. A single warm glow in the wet dark. He watched it for a long time. Then, slowly, he turned it off with the remote switch he still carried on his keychain. Darkness fell across the windows. He drove through the city without destination. The rain blurred the streets, turned stoplights into bleeding colors. Each intersection looked like a choice he had already made. He drove until the sky began to pale, until exhaustion pressed against his eyes like a weight. On the outskirts of Portland, he found a motel. Anonymous, quiet, the kind of place people pass through, not arrive at. He checked in under his first name only. The clerk didn't ask questions. They never do when someone looks the way he did. Not broken, not angry, just emptied. In the small room, he dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the bed. The silence was different here, cleaner, almost kind. For the first time in years, there were no footsteps above him. No slammed doors, no laughter laced with contempt. Just the hum of the air conditioner and the faint patter of rain against the window. He slept for 12 hours straight. When he woke, it was noon. Light filled the room, soft and forgiving. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and felt something shift inside him. Not peace, but distance. The pain was still there, but quieter, like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. He checked his phone. Dozens of missed calls. Messages. From Sarah. At first angry. Where are you? This isn't funny. Then frantic. You took the money? What's wrong with you? Then soft. Please just call me. Please. He read them all. Then turned off the phone. He wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That night he drove west. Toward the ocean. The rain had stopped, and the highway shimmered under the moonlight. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe freedom. He reached the coast just before dawn. Pulled over by the cliffs, got out, and stood there, the wind biting at his face. Below him, the sea moved like something alive, endless, indifferent, honest. He thought about Sarah, about the years he'd spent holding a world together with his bare hands, hoping love would be enough. And he realized something then. Love isn't enough when it's one-sided. It becomes servitude. He stood there until the sun rose, painting the horizon gold. Then he whispered, "Let her learn." The waves answered for him, cold, steady, eternal. Morning came without promise. The sea was gray, patient, endless. For the first time in his life, Michael felt small in a way that wasn't painful, just true. The waves erased his footprints as soon as he made them. That felt right. He rented a small cottage near the Oregon coast. 2 rooms, crooked floors, salt in the walls. The landlord warned him about the wind, how it rattled the windows all night. Michael said he didn't mind. Noise was better than memory. He filled the place slowly, with books from thrift stores, a coffee pot that hissed like an old friend, a single chair facing the water. Nothing personal, nothing fragile. He worked remotely now, taking contract jobs that required precision but not presence. Each morning he brewed coffee, sat by the window, watched gulls wheel against the sky. Life reduced itself to simple acts. Wake, work, walk, sleep. Peace came not as comfort but as absence. At first he expected guilt. He waited for it the way one waits for a storm. It never came. What arrived instead was clarity. Every quiet evening, every unringing phone confirmed what he already knew. Regret belongs to those who stay too long, not those who finally leave. Weeks passed, then months. Seasons changed their color around him. He stopped checking his email for messages from her. The world beyond the coast faded until it felt like a rumor. But the world never forgets what it's owed. Around Christmas, his sister Elizabeth called. Her voice cracked through the static like something fragile trying not to break. "She's been looking for you," she said. "Sarah, she's different now." He didn't ask how. He didn't want to hear words like sorry or grown up or realizes what she's done. Apologies were currency spent too late. He only said, "Tell her I'm fine," and hung up before the silence turned heavy. After that, letters began to arrive. Not many, just enough to remind him that the past still breathed. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. "I miss you. I understand now. Please write back." He read them once, neatly folded them, and slid them into a drawer. They weren't accusations, but neither were they absolution. Some nights he dreamed of the old house, the yellow light in the kitchen, the echo of footsteps on the stairs. In those dreams, he always heard the same sound. The soft click of the door closing behind him. It no longer hurt. It sounded like freedom. A year slipped by. The days blended, gentle and unmarked, until one morning in late September, when he drove into the city for groceries and found himself parked near the university. It wasn't intentional. Maybe memory guides the hands when the heart refuses. He stepped out, walked past students scattered across the courtyard, their laughter cutting through the air like glass. And then he saw her, Sarah. She stood by the crosswalk, papers clutched to her chest, hair tied back, her face sharper now, thinner. The arrogance that once hung on her like perfume was gone. She looked older, not by years but by weight. For a moment, he thought she was a ghost conjured by guilt. But when she turned and their eyes met, reality hit with quiet force. Neither of them moved. She hesitated, as if her body remembered the act of walking toward him, but her pride forgot how. Then she took one cautious step, and another. When she was close enough to speak, Her voice cracked like the edge of winter. "Hi, Dad." The word landed differently this time. No demand, no irony, just need. He nodded. "Sarah." They stood in the noise of passing cars. Two people bound by history but separated by choice. She tried to smile, but it wavered. "I didn't know if you'd ever." He shook his head gently. "It's all right." Tears filled her eyes, but he knew they weren't enough. Remorse is a shadow, it shows up after the damage, when light finally returns. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." He looked at her then. Not with anger, not even pity, but a kind of weary understanding. "You learned," he said. "That's what matters." She nodded quickly, like a child caught between hope and shame. Can we talk? Maybe have coffee or—" He glanced toward the cafe across the street. The same kind of place where everything between them had first cracked. The irony wasn't lost on him. He smiled, small and sad. "Not today." Her face fell. "I just wanted to see you." "And you have," he said. For a long second, neither spoke. The wind tugged at her papers, scattering one across the pavement. She bent to catch it, he didn't move to help. She gathered them in trembling hands. When she straightened, he was already stepping back. "Take care of yourself," he said. The same words he'd left on the note a year ago. Only now they carried no bitterness, no finality, just truth. She reached out as if to touch his sleeve, but stopped halfway. Some distances aren't meant to be crossed twice. He nodded once more, then turned away. She watched him go until the crowd swallowed him. He didn't look back. Not because he didn't care, but because some memories lose their meaning when revisited. What once was love had become understanding, and understanding requires distance. He drove back to the coast before dusk. The sea was rough that evening, restless, as if echoing something unresolved. He brewed coffee, sat by the window, and set the old watch on the shelf beside him. Ticked steadily, indifferent to memory. He realized he didn't hate her. He never had. Hate needs hope to survive, and he'd run out of that long ago. What he felt now was quieter. A love stripped of expectation. The kind that asks for nothing, not even return. Outside, the tide crept closer to the rocks. He thought about how the ocean gives and takes with the same hand, and how people do, too. He wondered if she would be all right. He believed she would. Pain teaches faster than protection ever could. As night fell, he whispered the same words he'd told the sea a year before. Let her learn. The wind carried them out through the open window, dissolving into the endless dark. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the rhythmic heartbeat of waves against stone. Somewhere beyond the horizon, his daughter lived her own quiet reckoning. Somewhere, perhaps, she was watching the same sky. Time moved. The watch ticked. The tide turned. Michael closed his eyes. He had walked away once and never looked back. But walking away wasn't the same as abandoning. It was survival disguised as loss. He thought of all the years he'd mistaken endurance for love, silence for peace, forgiveness for duty. And he knew, at last, that letting go had been the most faithful thing he'd ever done. Because sometimes, the only way to remain a father is to stop being one. He opened his eyes again, looked toward the sea, and asked the question that had followed him through every season since he left. Was I wrong? The water didn't answer. It never does. But its silence was kind.